Okay, we're moving on to part 2 of our mask building project, which is the painting step. So before you begin painting, you want to take your mask and just make sure that it is fully sealed. You can hold it up to the light, and that'll help you observe if there's any light spots or weak spots in the mask. You can also sort of gently bend or push it to see if it feels strong or weak in any way. And of course, make sure that it's smooth enough for your liking. Any excess stuff that's hanging off the edges for either type of method, you can easily take a pair of scissors and try to cut them off like that. Just a reminder that plaster, that is about the best you'll be able to do, is cut off the edges. You're not going to be able to cut new shapes into the inside of it. However, paper mache, this is your opportunity to draw any shapes that you want that you can then cut out. If you're cutting something inside, you're going to want to use an X-Acto blade or some other type of blade to be able to cut more precisely the inside parts. If it's simply the outside edge, again, you can use the X-Acto blade. If you'd like to, you can also use a pair of scissors. So definitely before you start painting, make sure you've trimmed your mask and cut out any details that you want to cut out. Okay, after you have trimmed your mask, you're going to want to take it off of the mask mold if you haven't already. You don't want to paint your mask while it's on top of the mask mold. It will get the mask mold covered in paint, which is really not a great idea. Don't necessarily get rid of the mold, but just set it aside. And we're going to get ready to do our base coat of painting. Now, base painting, when I use the word base painting, I'm referring to the foundational layer of the color that's going to be underneath everything else. So just like when we did base building and I talked about doing those first initial several layers before we built the details like the nose and the ears and other details, the base is what's going to support everything on top of it. So whatever color is going to be the majority of that's what you want to use first. Once it's dry, we can add any details we need to add. So definitely focus on your base color. It could be just one color, it could be two colors, but you shouldn't be picking all the colors. We want to make sure everything is dry before we start doing those details. I do have a video linked up above in the corner as well as in the description box if you want to get some more information about brush care and palette care, because what we're going to be using for this is acrylic paint. Acrylic paint is a type of paint that when it dries, it's very hard and somewhat permanent, so you have to be really careful about the way you clean your brushes and the way you take care of your palettes and things like that. So again, I'll have that video linked. I'm not going to go through all the details of it right now, but if you want to know some more about it, click that link and you can watch that video. So I'm going to take my base color, this sort of like orangey yellow tone, and I'm going to be painting my entire mask with it. Sometimes you might realize that you need more than one coat, especially if it's a thinner, lighter color. This orangey yellow color definitely has a bit of a see-through, translucent quality to it, and so you can see the paper underneath this, and that's going to mean that I'm going to want to probably do this more than one time. But for now, I'm just going to do one coat of the color all over. And if there's any weird cracks or crevices I can't get into, sometimes brushing flat isn't enough. As you can see, there are some parts that I'm missing, some little holes there. So instead, what I might do occasionally is to push my brush into the mask instead of brushing against it. That'll help get into those little divots and cracks a little bit easier. So I completed one layer of my cat painting mask. Now, just one thing I want to bring up, if you want to do your second layer right away, you can. Sometimes when the first layer is still wet, it doesn't really stick as well, so sometimes you do need to let it dry in between layers. But one question I often get asked is, do I really need to paint anything at all, especially if I'm planning on doing a lot of textures on top? Maybe you're planning on adding some fake fur or something else, something that's going to be completely covering the mask, I still recommend doing a base coat of something, even if it's just a neutral color like white, black, brown, because as good as you think you are at doing your textures, there is a good chance that there's going to be little cracks or little seams that are going to pop through, and you're going to be able to see the underneath base color. And it's much nicer if it's an actual solid color versus if it's the kind of brown or white material that you use to kind of create the actual mask. When you're done painting your mask, if you made your mask out of paper mache, I highly recommend letting it dry on your mask mold. You don't need to do this if it's plaster. Plaster is very strong. It really doesn't need the support of the mask mold. But what can happen with paper mache is, because it is made with primarily paper, when it's wet with paint, it does tend to want to shrink and warp when it dries. And because of that potential shrinkage, we don't want it to not have a base underneath it, the support underneath it, to make sure it doesn't lose its shape. So the mask mold is there to help just make sure it dries in the same shape that it started, so it doesn't dry in a weird warped shape. So I'm going to take this and set it aside and demonstrate a different base painting technique. So the first method I showed you using just one color for your background color. Most people are going to want that because a lot of times you do have lots of fine details you want to put on it, and painting more than one color at the same time is just going to smudge and smear your details everywhere. They're not going to look good at all. So you want to make sure you have a background color, wait for it to dry, then put your details on top. But let's say you do want them to smear and smudge. Maybe you want to create a ombre effect or a textured effect, and that might be something I wanted to do here. So I already started it so you can kind of see where it's going, and I'm going to show you how I got to this point. What I decided I wanted to do was have a black into red ombre sort of look, and I also wanted some texture on it as well. So what I'm going to do is demonstrate how I got here and how I'm going to finish this. So instead of having just one color on your palette, you might want to have more than one color. So I have two colors here. I have this black and this deep red. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm actually going to be painting both colors back and forth so that the colors, while they're both still wet, will bleed and smear and smudge together, because I actually do want that effect. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to start with my red, because black is a very intense color and it can really darken too much the colors if I'm not ready for it. So I'm going to paint some red on here first. So I did my layer of red. And one thing I want to point out is when you're painting, you do want to hold your mask and tip it around, because as you can see, I tip it this way and suddenly there's this nice white spot that I can see inside the eyes that I couldn't see from where it was laying before. So it is important that you pick up your mask and look at it from multiple perspectives so that you're making sure you're not overlooking or missing any white spots or details that you were supposed to get but kind of overlooked. All right, once you have your first color down, if you are doing a blended ombre or textured look, you want to make sure that first color is somewhat still damp. So I'm going to re-wet this red in this one section just to make sure it's nice and wet still. And you can see from this camera how it's shiny and wet. And then I'm going to take my paint and I'm going to dip the same brush into the second color. You can also use a second brush if you want. But I'm going to use the same one, and I'm going to just layer it where I want to have that color. And I'm not worrying that there's a little bit of red getting into the black, because as I said, I want this to be sort of a textured look. So I am now going to sort of dab the black into the red a little bit. And it creates this really cool sort of mottled textured look, because the wet is going into the wet. Now, if you ever go too far, you say, wow, that black really went too far, or whatever color you're mixing together went further than you wanted it to go, like it's starting to bleed into where you were hoping it would stay that other color, you can just swap back, get some more of that other color, and go back on top. You can also get a second brush, maybe one brush for each color. So whenever I get too black, I can pull up my red brush and start dabbing with just the red. And anytime it gets too red, I can pull up my black brush. I'm just using the same brush because I'm really okay with them getting really messy and smeary together, because that is kind of the effect I'm trying to go for. Once you're satisfied with it, you can let it dry, and then if you have any further details that you didn't want to have bleed with it, you can wait for that. I'm actually going to paint the horns a different color, so I'm going to wait until this is all dry, and then I can go over it, because I do want those to be crisp and clean and not bleed into anything. And there might be a few other details I'm going to highlight. So I'm going to let this dry. I'm going to clean my brush, throw out my paper paint palette, unless you have it on a different type of palette where you can save it. And I'll go back into with details. When the details are done, we're going to move on to part 3, which is textures. So now we're on to the third and final step of working with our masks. So once you've built your mask, whether it is with plaster, paper mache, or whatever other material, after you've painted it, so in this case I just painted this all one color because my intention is to use a lot of textures to really make this come to life. This one I did a little bit more painting with. I thought about the textures of the paint. I also added some details when the other parts were dry. But once you're done painting everything, the last step to really finish this off is to add some textures to it. Now, you have to think very carefully about what kinds of textures you're going to add, how many you're going to add, and make sure that the ones you're adding are there to enhance your design, meaning make it better, and don't take away from your design. So for example, here we have a really nice panda mask. This was done using paper mache, as you can see on the back, and it was then painted with black and white paint, and finally the texture that was added was something that was going to enhance it, make it feel more like a panda. So what was used here were feathers. So we have lots of black feathers, white feathers, in different areas that are glued down in such a way that it really makes the whole mask feel very fluffy, furry, and soft, which just enhances the look of it. It doesn't take away from it. We can definitely identify what's happening. So when I am thinking about my masks, I have to think about what textures I think would be best for the purpose of the mask. So if this mask is meant to look like an animal, I might want to do something similar as what I did with the panda, adding feathers or other elements to make it look soft and fluffy. Whereas this one, the purpose might be something a little bit different. This one feels a little bit darker. Maybe the purpose is to be scary or to be for protection. In any case, this is going to use different textures than what the other one might want to use. So instead of using feathers or glitter, gemstones are really fun, but that might not really well suit the purpose of this particular mask. Colorful pom-poms, again, might not really match up with the vibe of the mask. All right, what I'm going to be doing now is gluing some elements to my mask to enhance the design. So I'm being careful and thoughtful about what I'm going to add, where I'm going to add it, and how I'm going to put it in. Make sure that when you are ready to attach things that you're thinking carefully about it, you're actually organizing and planning. You're not just slapping things down for the sake of slapping it down. It will definitely show how careless you're being if you are not taking your time and thinking about it. So when I'm ready, and if I'm going to use liquid glue, obviously most of you know how to use liquid glue appropriately. If you are using glue, a couple things to remind yourself, some safety tips. Please make sure you're always working over a placemat so that any glue, whether it's liquid or hot glue, can get onto the placemat, not onto your table or workspace. Secondly, be very careful. This tip area can be very, very hot. You want to be careful not to touch it directly with your fingertips, and also be careful when you're attaching things. For example, if I'm going to put this plastic spider design onto the mask, rather than holding this tiny small piece in my hand and putting the glue directly on it, my risk of me getting my fingertips burnt is very high if I'm holding this tiny object and trying to glue directly on it. It's a much safer way if I glue directly on the mask. So once I know exactly where it's going to go, I can take my glue and directly apply it to the mask itself. Gently put it in and lightly tap it. You can use your fingertip, or you can use something else, maybe the back of a pen or a pencil, to push down, just to make sure that you don't actually get your fingers touching it, but you are using some object to help support it. This same idea goes for anything that's thin. So if I was doing feathers, for example, or glitter or any of that stuff, first of all, I wouldn't use hot glue with glitter. I would use regular glue. If you are going to use hot glue for things like feathers, or maybe sheer mesh or felt or something like that, your fingertips could definitely get hurt by just touching it, because it's so thin. You can definitely get the glue seeping through. So again, you're going to want to use an object or something to push and hold against the material instead of your fingers, so that they just don't get damaged. So definitely be wise and careful and cautious when working with hot glue, because you can seriously burn yourself. Another thing to consider, if you are having any desire to use wire or anything that has metal in it and you're attaching it to your object, another thing to be aware of if you're using a hot glue gun is that metal conducts heat. That means the heat is going to travel through the metal from one end to the other. So if I am going to be, let's say, putting some metal behind the eyes or right where the eyes are, let's say I want to take this metal piece and glue it onto the eye area. I might feel safe because my thumb is not anywhere near where the glue is on either end of where it's going to be attached. But again, metal conducts heat. So the heat from one end and the other end is going to travel through the metal, and it's going to be felt by my thumb, even though it's not directly on it. So again, you might want to use an object to help hold it and push it down, rather than your own finger, so that you don't injure yourself. So attach your pieces, attach any details you decide you want to add. Be thoughtful, think about what you're doing before you do it, and again, safety first, be really careful. Okay, and here I have a finished texture addition to my mask. I think that I am pleased with the amount of textures, the type of textures, and the placement of textures. I thought about which items would be the best fitting for my purpose and to continue the theme and the vibe of my mask. And I also thought very carefully about placement and made sure that I did not get my fingers anywhere near the hot glue, so that everything is securely glued on, but without me having burned myself. Now, you get to the end point, take a quick last look, make sure there's no areas you need to touch up with paint. I might have a couple areas I might want to touch up with the paint, since I decided to use a nail to poke a hole through. You certainly don't have to do things like that. I just chose to do that because I thought it might make it a little bit more secure, having them weaved through. But if you'd prefer to just have things laid on top, that's fine too. But since I did do that, I will be going through with a touch of paint just at the end here to freshen it up. Anyway, I hope you guys had a lot of fun making these masks, experimenting with me, and I cannot wait to see what types of textures you use, what types of colors, and how these really cool, unique masks are going to come out. Have fun!